Some years ago, after giving a lecture at a conference, I was rather alarmed to see an esteemed colleague come towards me and point out a couple of mistakes I'd made in the lecture. The first mistake I put down to reading the wrong book. The second mistake shocked me to the core. "There is no such thing as a treble clef," said John. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the fascinating story of musical clefs and prove that John was right. There is no such thing as a treble clef. In the 21st century, it's very easy to take musical notation for granted. But prior to the 11th century, Western music had no really useful method for notation at all. This had its problems. Without a means of writing music down, music had to be memorized. The church dealt with this by establishing singing schools, or schola cantorum, where students from all over Europe would spend up to 9 years learning by heart the hundreds of hymns, chants and masses in the church's repertoire. Returning to their villages and towns, these musicians were the local repositories of musical knowledge. They had some help from a very rudimentary form of notation, nothing more than dots and dashes called neumes placed above the text of a song to indicate the shape of the melody. Things changed in the 11th century thanks to a Benedictine monk in the beautiful Tuscan village of Arezzo. Guido of Arezzo, or Guido d'Arezzo, was undoubtedly one of the most important figures in the history of Western music. It is generally believed that Guido was the first to develop a staff system for notating music, and he produced other important innovations, including the use of solfa and a system for representing pitch on the hand. Legend has it that, while contemplating life in the cloisters of the monastery one day, Guido rather randomly drew a series of lines on the ground. Then a little miracle happened. Rain began to fall, and Guido saw in the raindrops the birth of the musical staff. There's no doubt that this is one of the greatest days in music history. It meant that for the first time, melodies could be written down and accurately transmitted around the world. Guido had great reason to be thankful. The first staff used just 4 lines, with the letter C used to indicate the position of the note C. This C was the first clef. The word clef comes from the Latin word clavus, which means key, and from which we also get the word keyboard. A key gives us access to something, and a musical clef similarly gives us access to something, in this case knowledge. It allows us to name the notes as they appear on the staff. Without the clef, the staff would be much less meaningful. Our modern clefs come directly from these early clefs. We've seen that C could be used as a clef, and the other early clef was the letter F. Over time, this clef morphed into something that barely resembles an F, and at the same time the musical staff increased from 4 to 5 lines. But the important thing is that the clef still tells us where the note F is, and so we call it the F clef. From here, it's a simple matter to work out that the next note up is G, then A, and from here we can work out all of the names of the notes on the staff. And so we have the F clef, used by cellos, bassoons, basses, trombones, and of course the left hand of the piano. What about that original C clef? Well, it also morphed into a modern clef, though the modern version is even more removed from the original than in the case of the F clef. The middle of the clef gives us middle C, and this clef is typically used by viola players and occasionally by alto trombonists. One clef remains, the best known and also the most recent, and this is the G clef. The G clef was not used until much later than the F and C clefs, and its shape really has undergone an unrecognisable transformation from a G to, well, a modern G clef. To see how these clefs relate to each other, here is middle C, first shown using the G clef, then the C clef, then the F clef. Now we turn to the staff, and it's important to get something straight. A staff is a set of lines. A clef is a curly thing. You might have noticed that so far I have mentioned the F clef, the C clef, and the G clef. I have not used the words bass clef, alto clef, or treble clef. Why? Because these things don't exist. Let me explain. This is a staff. This is the G clef. When we place the G clef on the second line of the staff, it becomes not the treble clef, but the treble staff. Similarly, here is a C clef. When it is on the middle line of the staff, it produces not the alto clef, but the alto staff. And again, the F clef produces the bass staff. Why is this important? Well, it's important because these clefs can move up and down to produce different staves. For example, if the C clef is moved up to the next line, it produces the tenor staff. You can see that the clef itself hasn't changed. It still looks the same. So ideally, we shouldn't talk about the alto clef or the tenor clef, but the alto and tenor staves. In the same way, the G clef can move to produce what's called the French violin staff, and the F clef can produce the baritone staff. We're almost done, but one question remains. Why do we need different clefs and staves, and how do we choose the best staff for the occasion? The answer is that we should aim to make music as easy to read as possible, and that means, for one thing, reducing ledger lines to a minimum. Here is the same note, written 3 times on the staff. The bass and alto versions are fine, but the treble staff is not. Here's a different note, written 3 ways. This time, the alto and treble versions are fine, but the bass staff is truly horrible. And here is a great example from the string trio of Webern of using and changing clefs to make more legible. Doesn't necessarily make the music easier to play. So there's really only one thing left to say. This is not a treble clef. It's a G clef. This is not a treble clef. It's a treble staff. There is no such thing as a treble clef.